When the sword was lowered, the first drop of rain hadn't even touched the ground when the palace doors burst open, and that single sound changed the fate of an entire kingdom. Princess Alara, known throughout Elmore for her ever-present smile, stood at her window that evening, staring into the darkness, hiding tears no one had ever seen her cry. Her mother, Queen Seraphine, had passed away that very morning, and the palace's ancient law was clear. Members of the royal family grieved alone. No weakness, no exceptions, not even in death. But that night something was about to break. The guard who remembered Captain Alden Voss had served as head of the Royal Guard for 20 years. He joined as a boy of 16, orphaned and hungry, taken in by the old captain who saw something steady in him. Over 2 decades he had memorized every rule the palace ever wrote: when to speak, when to stay silent, when to look away, when to become invisible. His men respected him not because he was harsh, but because he never once broke a rule. Not in 20 years. He had buried his own mother at the age of 12, alone in a small village far from any palace, with no one beside him but the wind and a borrowed shovel. He remembered walking home that night past houses glowing with warm light, hearing families laugh behind closed doors, and feeling for the first time what true loneliness meant. He swore then that if he ever had the power to stop someone else from feeling that same emptiness, he would. He never imagined that promise would put him at odds with the very laws he'd sworn to protect. That night, he stood at his post outside the princess's chambers when he heard it, the faint, muffled sound of someone trying not to cry. His duty was to stand still, say nothing, feel nothing. Guards never involved themselves in the private grief of royalty. It was law older than the kingdom itself, written into the very stone of the palace foundations. But Alden lowered his sword. It was the first time in Elmore's history that a guard had set down his weapon without the presence of a threat. The 2 younger guards flanking the corridor stared in disbelief as their captain walked toward the door. "Sir, the protocol," one of them whispered, glancing nervously down the corridor as if the walls themselves might report the disobedience. "Protocol can wait tonight," Alden replied, his voice carrying a firmness none of them had ever heard from him before. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, softer this time. "Princess Alara, I know this isn't my place. But no one should grieve alone, not while I'm standing here." A long silence followed. Then the door opened. 2 people. No titles. Alara's eyes were swollen, her hands trembling. She had never heard a guard speak to her like that. Never once had one looked her in the eye. They were always shadows, silent and distant. Trained to be invisible. "Present only in the way furniture is present. You shouldn't be here," she said, though there was no anger in her voice. "Perhaps not," Alden said quietly. "But I lost my mother too when I was young. No one held my hand that night. I didn't want you to feel that same loneliness." She stepped aside, and for the first time, a guard crossed the threshold of a royal chamber not to protect a life, but to sit beside a breaking heart. They didn't speak much that night. Sometimes he simply stayed near the door, letting his presence be enough. Around midnight, Alara finally asked him about his mother, and he told her, briefly without drama, about the small house, the fever that took her, the silence afterward. It wasn't a story of triumph. It was simply true, and that honesty settled something in her chest that had been tightening for hours. Before dawn, Alden rose to leave, knowing the other guards would soon change shifts. At the door, Alara stopped him. "Why did you really come in?" she asked. "You could have lost everything. Your rank, your position, everything you built in 20 years. Alden considered the question carefully. "Because some rules protect a kingdom," he said, "and some rules only protect our comfort in pretending pain doesn't exist. I couldn't tell which one this was until I was standing at your door. Once I heard you crying, there was no version of tonight where I stayed silent. The council's fury by morning. Word had spread through every corridor of the palace like smoke through corridors with no windows. The king's chief advisor, Lord Barrick, was furious. "This is defiance," he shouted in the council hall, his fist striking the table hard enough to rattle the goblets. A guard abandoned his post, went for a moment of sentiment. What next? Soldiers weeping on the battlefield instead of fighting. Shall we tear down every wall this kingdom was built on because one man couldn't control himself? Other advisors murmured in agreement, some nodding grimly, others glancing toward the throne to gauge the king's mood. But King Cassian, broken by grief himself, sat quietly listening, his eyes fixed on the floor as though the answer might be written there. When Lord Beric demanded punishment, dismissal at the very least, imprisonment if the council wished to make an example, the king finally spoke. "Tell me, Beric," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. "When you lost your own wife 3 winters ago, did you feel no need for anyone beside you? Did you not once wish someone had knocked on your door instead of leaving you to your silence?" The hall fell still. Even Beric, for the first time in years, had no answer ready. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "We built these protocols to keep the palace strong," the king continued, rising slowly from his throne, each word deliberate. "But somewhere along the way we forgot that strength doesn't only live in walls and swords. It lives in hearts too. Captain Alden did nothing wrong. He did what humanity demands of us, something the rest of us were too afraid, or too proud to do ourselves." Before Lord Beric could argue further, the king raised his hand, silencing the room entirely. "From this day forward, there will be a new law," he announced, his voice steady despite his own grief. "Our guards will not only stand with swords, their hearts will belong to this palace too. When any member of the royal family suffers in grief, any guard may leave his post to comfort them without fear of punishment. Compassion will no longer be treated as a crime." And Elmore murmurs spread through the hall, some approving, a few uncertain, wondering aloud what such a law might mean for discipline in years to come. Lord Beric said nothing more, but the hard line of his mouth made clear the matter was far from settled in his mind. A kingdom watching. The news spread through the kingdom like wildfire, faster than any royal decree in memory. In the markets, in the farmlands, in the taverns near the city walls, people began to say, "Elmore has a king who understands the hearts of his people." Some called it weakness, muttering that a kingdom run on sentiment would crumble at its first true test. Most called it courage, the kind rarely seen from those who sit on thrones. Soldiers in distant garrisons heard the story and told it to one another around campfires, adding their own details each time it was retold. Mothers told it to their children as a bedtime tale about the guard who chose kindness over rules. Within a season, it had become something closer to legend than history. Months passed. Ilara slowly began to heal from her grief, though healing, she learned, was never a straight road. Some days the loss struck her freshly, without warning, in the middle of a meal or a walk through the garden. But something had changed. She no longer walked the palace halls alone. Sometimes Alden walked beside her, not as a shadow anymore, but as someone she trusted completely. They would talk, sometimes of the kingdom's affairs and the weight of the crown she would one day inherit, sometimes simply of life's smaller moments. A bird nesting near the eastern tower, a poem she'd once read as a child, a memory of her mother's laughter echoing through the summer gardens. Lord Beric watched this closely, his suspicion never fully softening. And one evening he approached the king again. "People are talking, Your Majesty, about the princess, about the captain. Perhaps it's time he returned to his usual duties, for the sake of appearances, if nothing else." The king studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. "Beric, my daughter has smiled more in these past months than she did in the entire year before her mother's passing. Tell me, whose appearances are we protecting here? The kingdom's or your own comfort with how things have always been done?" Beric had no reply, and he never raised the matter again, though he continued to watch from a distance. Unconvinced but silent, the garden one afternoon, as Ilara sat in the garden watching the flowers sway in the breeze. Alden approached, his sword fastened at his side as always, the weight of it now feeling less like duty and more like habit. "Do you remember?" he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "The night I set down my sword." Ilara smiled, a smile that had grown easier, softer, more her own again with each passing month. "I'll never forget it. It was the first time I felt like a person instead of a title. Before that night, I don't think anyone in this palace had looked at me and seen